everybody. It is 6:30. I will call the Finance and Administration Committee meeting to order. First off, public hearings and public comments. We don't have any public hearings tonight. Do we have any public comments on items that are not on the agenda? All right, we don't have any public presentations, but we do have 3 action items. Up first is a resolution calling a public hearing on the division of the Rock Creek Redevelopment TIF District. Laura.
Thank you, and thank you all for accommodating the meeting this evening. We like to use these sparingly, the supplemental committee meeting dates, but certainly felt like there was enough information that we wanted to keep moving forward to meet this evening. So in your packet, as we really have delved into steps looking at reevaluation and amendments to the Gateway Redevelopment Agreement and potential consideration of the issuance of special obligation bonds, we've identified several issues that relate to the underlying Tax Increment Financing, or TIF district. One of the things, and Emily, if you could find the map that is Appendix A, I think. So when the Rock Creek TIF district was created in 2006, the district contains about 71 acres of property which generally follow the Rock Creek floodplain from Roe Boulevard to Lamar. And this map, which was included in your packet, indicates that. The larger district was created to really aid in redevelopment in that area because much of this property was put into the floodplain because of revisions to the FEMA floodplain maps. So it had previously not existed in a floodplain, and that was revised, and that certainly limits the redevelopment opportunities for those properties. So it was a large district, and within that district there were 4 redevelopment project areas. In 2009, the district was amended to include 5 redevelopment project areas. So areas 1, 3, and 4 remained as they had been previously established, and within area 2, a separate redevelopment district was created that encompassed the Capital Federal property. So there is an approved TIF project plan at what is now referred to as Project Area 2A. So within the TIF Act, it provides that the increment is computed on a district-wide basis. And this works well when you have a single project area within a district, or when you have multiple project areas, if all of your project areas are generating positive incremental assessed valuation. The challenges arise when you have some project areas that are generating positive increment and some that are generating negative increment. Because those with positive increment are unable to be reimbursed or compensated until the entire district is generating a positive increment. So since its creation, the Rock Creek District has not experienced, as a district of the whole, positive incremental assessed valuation. However, there are certain redevelopment areas within the district that are experiencing that. And so you might say, why do we care about that? Why does that matter? So really the application of the TIF Act is somewhat inconsistent with the approach that we take when we review and establish project plans within the larger district. And at least in our case, with the 2 approved project plans within the Rock Creek District, which are the Capital Federal 2A and then the Gateway, those were approved really with an assumption that they would be able to receive the TIF incentives that were generated specifically by their project. Currently, neither one of those projects can receive TIF revenues, although one is generating positive increment and one is generating negative increment, until the entire 71-acre district started generating a positive increment. In your packet, there was a table which illustrated the 5 separate project areas within the Rock Creek Redevelopment District, 3 of which are currently generating positive incremental assessed value, 2 of which are not. And so as we've looked at that, and particularly as it relates to the Gateway, although this is not specifically or entirely a Gateway issue, we began to have some conversations around what was the fair way to allocate that future incremental property tax revenue between the Gateway site, cap-fed, and the remaining project areas. And then particularly if we were going to proceed with bond issuance related to Gateway project costs, how could we mitigate risk to bondholders for future decreases in assessed value in other project areas that could impact the revenues that might be afforded to that particular project. So as we looked at how do we then address those concerns or mitigate those concerns, one of the things that we identified in order to preserve the greatest amount of flexibility for the city was a recommendation that the City Council proceed to split the existing Rock Creek district into separate districts. So in order to accomplish this, the city has to provide the same notice and hold a public hearing as was required when the original district was established. So this evening, you have included in your packet a resolution which would be considered next week at your October 16th meeting, calling a public hearing on the separation of the districts. That hearing date has to be no less than 30 days or no more than 70 days following adoption of the resolution. So that gives us a fairly narrow window within which to accomplish that public hearing. We have to give notice of that public hearing to the county, the school district, and all the property owners and occupants within the district sent via certified mail. Now, the county and the school district do not have veto power or rights as they do when the district was originally established. We would then look at calling the resolution, adopting the resolution to call the public hearing on October 16th, setting the public hearing for the November 18th meeting. And you will recall that last week we talked about moving that meeting date up. Typically we would be meeting November 20th, but at least 3 of you are not able to attend that meeting. So we're looking at moving that November meeting to the 18th. And then following the public hearing, the council could adopt an ordinance splitting the area into separate districts. So the advantages of this approach, we truly believe it allows each project area or district to receive the increment attributable only to activities within that specific area. It's consistent with the business deals that were approved already for the Gateway and the Capital Federal TIF. It likely helps with marketing of Gateway bonds by establishing less risk for investors. And it really provides the City Council with the opportunity to evaluate the necessity and value of maintaining such a large TIF district. So when we get to the November 18th meeting, you can separate it into 5 separate districts, or we can look at what you want to do from a bigger picture perspective with that large TIF district. As I mentioned, these actions that we're recommending this evening don't specifically benefit one property or another. But we feel like this is really an appropriate step, in part because of the length of time that has transpired since the district was originally established. There's been a lot of change in property valuation. We would anticipate with the demolition or pending demolition of the Mission Bowl property that could certainly impact and change some of the direction of the increment in that particular project area. So I'll stop there and answer any questions.
Is there a cost associated with this?
Just the cost of publication and mailing the certified notices to the property owners within the district.
Or have we heard anything from the property owners about this issue?
Well, the notices haven't been mailed. So,
Or I mean, had anyone come affirmatively and asked, like, why hasn't the distribution started yet?
no.
Okay.
So the only one where that would have applied would have been Capital Federal, and they have not really made any requests of the city since the TIF district was established.
So let's see, move this forward on that good stuff.
Just one quick thing on the on District 1, there's kind of a little piece that looks like it goes west of Roland. I'm just wondering, basically the Wendy's property. I'm looking at this right. The next slide you can see. I'm just wondering why that was part of District 1 there.
I don't think it is.
It's
The coloring of the.
I think it's the coloring of the map.
I mean,
Yeah.
So this
okay.
one is
A couple
the little,
pictures of it.
the colored
Okay.
I think that's a better, we've had difficulty
Well, if you-
for all
yeah.
these years with the colors in the map not
Well,
reproducing very well.
if you also look at where the black boundary line is drawn, it also
Correct.
cuts around that part, so it was a little unclear. I wasn't quite sure.
We will look at that. That may have been an we'll confirm that wasn't an adjustment that was made. You know what I believe that is that the Gateway developer actually owns that corner, not the Wendy's property. We'll look at that, but the developer bought the house that was on the corner at Roland Drive and Shawnee Mission Parkway and demolished that several years ago.
Okay.
So we'll look and confirm to see, that may be why that's incorporated within that Gateway Redevelopment District.
Are there any downsides to splitting these out into districts?
Not that, I mean, I think we've tried to run all the pros and cons on that, and we don't really believe there's a downside to doing that. Again, it preserves the greatest flexibility. You really only have projects that have been approved in those two areas. And again, I think we believe that those were approved intending to just collect the increment that was generated specifically by those projects.
You said non-consent?
Non-consent.
Our next agenda item is an amendment to the third amended and restated redevelopment agreement for the Gateway project. Laura.
So Emily, if you'll switch to our PowerPoint presentation. So we have our full city team and also some members of the developer team. Matt Valenti, who I think I got a chance to say hello to most of you, Cord Maxwell with Pulcinelli Law Firm, and then Rich Wood, also with Pulcinelli, who has been involved in our discussions in recent months. And we have Bruce Kimmel on the phone. Bruce didn't get to the airport today, but wanted to join us via phone. So he's going to sit in on our presentation and be available to present some of the information that he has collected and all that. So you should all have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and a variety of other handouts in front of you. So we're going to do kind of a tag team approach to our presentation tonight. Please feel free, as I know you will, to stop us as we kind of walk our way through the PowerPoint presentation, and so as we have questions along the way, be happy to stop and answer those. I think first and foremost, it's important to note that we all continue to share a common goal as it relates to this project, and that is getting the entire development completed according to the approved project plan so that both the developer and the City of Mission can benefit from that investment in our community. I'm sorry, this one doesn't show up very well. It's a little easier to see on your PowerPoint, but just what have we been working on in the last 6 to 9 months? There's been some significant activity around plans, plan review, and permitting of various components of the project. We've been looking at the necessary amendments to the redevelopment agreement, which we'll cover in significant detail this evening. Been doing due diligence, whether that relates to construction contracts or loan documents. There's a lot of work that has occurred and is ongoing in that area, and then preliminary steps in preparation for a special obligation bond issuance. So the first question is, why is it that we need to amend the redevelopment agreement in 2019? The 2017 redevelopment agreement, when it was adopted, included a phased approach to both construction and funding because the large entertainment retail anchor tenant had not been identified or secured by the developer. So in 2017, we adopted a redevelopment agreement that really created the path forward with the best information that we had at the time to get the project started while still affording certain benefits and protections to the city. In December of 2018, when the developer was able to secure a lease with Synergy for that large entertainment retail space, it resulted in a revision to the entire construction schedule for the project. And that construction schedule now doesn't fit within the parameters of our existing agreement. So we need to look at how do we align the 2019 amendment with the realities of the deal and the project as it stands today. So how did we approach and how have we been discussing the amendment? The key deal points from 2017 have really remained unchanged. The developer has not changed the components of the project, so the mixed use and all of those components that were approved as part of the final development plan have not changed. So we looked at and started from the premise and the deal points from 2017, which included the developer receiving 100% of the property TIF. The 1% general sales TIF would be shared between the developer at 55% and the city at 45%. The 9% transient guest tax revenues would be shared between the developer at 8% and the city at 1%. The developer was to receive 100% of the CID sales tax revenues, and the city agreed to issue special obligation bonds once certain milestones were reached. So we really looked at that about we aren't changing the points of the deal, but we need to keep comparable performance expectations and protections for the city and the investment that the city anticipates making into the project. We also had the opportunity, because of the progress that the developer had made with their private lenders, to review a new structure and terms that would be layered onto this deal by those private lenders. That has not been a component. In the past, we've really only included the developer and the city in those discussions. In our current discussions, the lender is absolutely part of those and really central to the progress forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian Scott to just kind of give us a quick update on the actual physical status of the project.
I know it seems like there hasn't been a lot going on in the site over the past year, and like you, I've gotten the phone calls too. And so I've spent time trying to explain that though there may not be a lot physically going on, there's a lot going on behind the scenes. So that's a little bit of the update that I wanted to give you tonight. I'm just going to kind of jump into it and sort of take you through the project. And some of you may not be familiar with all the components, so this will be kind of a good opportunity to refresh a little bit. The residential and small shop retail, this is basically 3 buildings that form a backwards L, the corner of Roland Drive and Johnson Drive. Each of the buildings is connected. Each of the buildings is 4 stories tall. 168 apartment units between all 3 buildings. A combination of 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom, and then ground floor retail, small retail on the ground floor. I think they already have a couple of leases signed in place with some potential tenants. Those plans were submitted last year. We reviewed those plans. We issued a permit in August of last year. They began work. Obviously, they stopped. The contractor has since pulled off the site. The construction manager, a firm named Fogel Anderson, that's the construction manager for the overall project, has stepped into the shoes of the contractor. So we've reissued the permit to them. And once the financing is finalized this fall, their anticipation is to go back and get started on that again. So they've actually been doing some work around there, just reaffirming all the construction that's taken place to date, making sure that's all still safe, and then from there, anticipating beginning construction right after the financing is in place later this fall. The hotel, we received plans late this winter for the hotel, probably early spring. It's a Marriott. The flagship is an Element Hotel, which is it's a flagship brand of Marriott that's kind of a sustainability component. So there's a lot of green emphasis placed on the entire hotel. It's 7 stories tall, 202 rooms with full hotel amenities, including a pool, meeting space, a breakfast bar. We are about done with the review. In fact, I got one last round of reviews this afternoon from the firm that's doing the reviews for us. I submitted those back to the architect, And I'm anticipating that we'll probably finish the review in a couple more weeks, and we'll be in a position where we're ready to issue a building permit to them. So, completion is anticipated to be 2021. The parking garage, this is 4 levels with 808 parking spaces. There's a total of 1,457 parking spaces throughout the project. So that includes the parking garage as well as ground floor, and then some of the on-street parking that you see along Johnson Drive. They have submitted construction drawings for the hotel. We are in the process, or excuse me, the parking garage. We are in the process of reviewing those right now. I anticipate we'll probably be finished with that by the end of the year. And at that point, construction will begin. The developer is actually wanting to go ahead and start with the foundations right now. So we may do a pre-approval on the foundations. We can start with that before the freeze kicks in, the winter weather. And really what's kind of driving that is the big centerpiece project, Synergy, which is a 90,000 square foot dine-in movie entertainment venue. There's 10 movie screens, a bowling alley, escape room, axe throwing, a variety of arcade type of activities. There's a bar, I think a couple restaurants. So it's really kind of a true entertainment venue. Synergy is a fairly new company. They're based out of Texas. They've got 4 or 5 locations in Texas, 1 in Oklahoma, and they're starting to expand further into the Midwest. So this is their first second expansion project. They submitted plans last winter. We reviewed those, and then we issued a building permit this summer. They have actually begun construction on that project, and the construction to this point has consisted of drilling the piers for the footings around the project. And they're kind of at a stopping point right now. What's stopping them is that there is a sanitary sewer line that kind of goes back behind the buildings along Shawnee Mission Parkway. And it sort of makes a funny kink right here, right below Synergy before it connects up across the street with that lift station on the other side of the road. And that needs to be realigned. So we went through a review process with the Johnson County Wastewater. I think it took a little bit longer than any of us anticipated, but we did get approval for that. And they have started construction on that. In fact, they're almost complete with construction. I think they just have to replace the final main. And then at that point, we'll be done with that. And then the developer can go ahead and kind of recertify the pad site and release the rest of it so that the contractor can get back in and finish those pier footings and start on that work. In addition to that, Water 1 is replacing a water main along the road, upgrading that. So that water line, my understanding is they'll service the fire line to the project as well as some of the taps too.
When will that water line be?
Right now, that's yeah, we're doing the work right now.
Is the parking a prefab structure?
Yes. Yeah. So it'll be much like what you're seeing over here at Mission Trails.
Okay.
Exactly. So it'll go up fast, probably faster than any of us anticipate.
Right.
And then it'll be, like I said last time, just kind of the infrastructure work with it, the lighting and the safety and aspects of it, and the striping spaces and all that. That'll take a little bit of time.
I got a question. The parking garage and the Synergy are both scheduled to be done in 2020. Will they be able to open up then while the rest of the...
That's exactly what's driving this, is that the developer is committed to Synergy, that the parking garage will be open and ready to provide the parking spaces that are needed for that venue. And those two had to be kind of done jointly. So really the anticipation is that they're both done at the same time, ready to be used.
Cool.
Ryan, are we far enough along that at some point we will be able to get a listing of what retail shops, what restaurants, and what bars will be going in?
Not yet for this kind of like, I call ground floor retail space and the residential component. I know a couple, just negotiations with the developer over the past couple of weeks, they've alluded to a couple, but I don't know if they're ready to release those names yet. But certainly when we get further enough along, we'll release that. The office building, the developer has submitted conceptual plans for the office building. It's gone to a 4-story building at 76,000 square feet. We're actually going to take this back to the planning commission at their meeting at the end of this month for them to review as kind of an amendment to the final development plan. And at that time, I'll kind of give them an update, so I can give you all an update on the progress of the project overall.
What's being changed on the office building?
Just the size of it.
Size?
Yeah.
What was it approved at before?
It's 3 stories, and it's about 58,000 square feet. I think they're negotiations, or they're finalizing negotiations for maybe 1 or 2 tenants, but they haven't released those names yet. And then finally, the food hall. I've seen some very conceptual plans on the food hall. It's going to be roughly a 2-story building, 40,000 square feet. About 8,000 of that's going to be devoted to a sit-down restaurant that will be run by Tom Licchio. And then the rest of it will be, I think there's a company called 5 Iron, which is kind of a concept indoor golf event space. So not quite Top Golf, kind of shrunk down, simpler version of Top Golf. And then the rest of the space will be just the food hall itself, which, if you all are kind of familiar with that concept, is a series of small spaces that are rented out to local chefs that can provide kind of a pop-up restaurant experience, or maybe providing 2 or 3 or 4 sort of signature menu items that you can purchase and eat kind of a general seating area, like a bar associated with that, and then some outdoor entertainment, possibly a concert venue, very small, kind of scaled down concert venue. So those plans are still very tentative, and the developer's working through those, but that's kind of the concept there.
Does that venue allow for the Mission Market to be part of that eventually, or no?
We haven't gotten that far along yet in the discussions.
There is some outdoor entertainment space that would be programmed. And at your place, and we'll upload to the packet, you have kind of a summary of all of those various project components that has been updated to reflect what Brian just walked through. And we will keep this format and continue to update this and get this out to you as the project continues to progress, because I know a lot of the questions that you have around this project relate to what's going on and the activity that people are seeing on the site. So next, we kind of move into the meat of our conversation tonight, and that is what is changing, or what are we proposing to amend in 2019 from the 2017 agreement. So I think it's important to remember what a redevelopment agreement does and what purpose it serves. It's really that document that outlines a project budget, the project schedule, the obligations of both the developer and the city, the process for certifying and reimbursing TIF and CID eligible expenses, requirements for transfer or sale of the property, and events of default and or remedies to potential events of default. What a development agreement does not do and cannot do is guarantee construction of the project. So it can protect our interest and our investment in that project, but we have to remember that even with that carrot and stick approach, ultimately the city doesn't own the property, and it is the developer's responsibility to construct that project. So we want to position, and the approach that we've taken with development agreement through the years is how do we position ourselves in partnership with the developer to try to ensure that, again, that common goal of getting this entire project completed according to the approved plan. So the 2019 amendment, we really believe, creates that roadmap for fulfilling the spirit and intent of the 2017 agreement with the specifics of the world as they exist in 2019. So I'd like to take just a little bit of time to walk through. I sent out, and you have at your place, a handout where we tried to go through and specifically kind of lay out side by side the comparisons and the areas where we're suggesting the amendments. It's not pretty, so I apologize for that. We struggled over the last month or so trying to come up with a format that was easy to go back and forth, but We'll do our best as we go through here. So I'm just going to start with the sections, and the amendment that was included in the packet, or is included in the packet, numbers those and outlines what would be replaced or revised in the agreement. So starting with section 1.01, which is really the definitions that exist throughout the redevelopment agreement. There was a change in the definition as it relates to the master funding agreement, and that's because the 2017 agreement contemplated one lender with the project. As we know, the realities of the 2019 deal, there are multiple lenders that are involved in this project, so that definition was revised to reflect that fact. TIF eligible project cost definition was revised, and really this is a clarification. Those definitions were sort of scattered in various places throughout the redevelopment agreement previously, and those have all been brought into focus. So there's no change in the definition. Again, that is simply a clarification. There is the addition of a new definition, which is priority approved TIF eligible costs. That definition was not included, did not exist in the 2017 agreement. It was added specifically in 2019 to tie the use of net bond proceeds to hard costs, primarily the construction of the parking garage. We wanted to look at a process whereby the developer and their lender could be assured that these costs had been vetted and certified by the city, so that there would be no question if we got to issuance of the special obligation bonds that those costs were already approved and authorized. So again, this is an opportunity to create some clarity around that issue. And then a CID bonds definition. In 2017, we contemplated issuance of 2 special obligation bonds, 1 TIF and 1 CID. As we've talked with the developer, the intent would be to have a single issue of TIF bonds only. So we went through the redevelopment agreement in 2017 and removed the references to the CID bond issue. Section 2.02. So section 2.02 in the 2017 agreement is where we laid out that phased approach to construction and or the development schedule. And in doing so, we used that section 2.02 to create certain milestone triggers that could be applied to construction completion dates that would allow us to then move to that special obligation bond issuance. That's the piece with the signing of the synergy lease and that sort of turning the construction schedule on its head was the section that really needed the most work. You'll see in the 2019 agreement, what we've done is provide for the project to be completed in a single phase. You should also note, or it's important to note, I think, that the overall construction completion deadline has been moved up by 12 months. And we'll talk more in the sections as we get to net bond proceeds, but so as we looked at eliminating controls and releases or triggers, if you will, for the bond proceeds in this section, we needed to replace them in other sections of the redevelopment agreement, which we'll come to shortly. We also, in section 2.02, replaced Exhibit B1, which is the development schedule, and so you'll see, again, those estimated completion timeframes tied to the various components of the project. Brian showed those on his slides, and again, the construction completion deadline moved up by 12 months. In section 2.03, we added the priority approved TIF eligible costs language. In that section, we also, in the 2017 agreement, included a limitation on TIF and CID funding of $13.3 million if only phase 1 of that project was completed. So you may recall that phase 1 was to be completed started with private financing, and the city's sort of comfort level and or protection in 2017 was to look at that and say, if that is the only portion of the project that is completed, we want to have some cap or limit on the amount of incentive funding that goes into that. And so that's what was driving that $13.3 million number in 2017. That phase 1 limitation obviously no longer applies. And so we moved to controls for the city's incentive funding in section 3.04E related to the distribution of net bond proceeds. And again, we'll cover those in detail in just a minute. And then Exhibit B has been updated to reflect the current project costs in 2019. In section 2.05, we really just cleaned up language to reflect kind of the current status of planning and zoning approvals for the 2019 project. It does not change any of the underlying requirements of the 2017 agreement. In section 3.01, which I believe is initial capital, the first paragraph outlines a requirement for a signed commitment letter as evidence of developer financing in the project. As we've been in conversation over the last several months, we have sort of moved from term sheets to actual loan documents, so we're likely to skip over that commitment letter piece. And so we wanted to revise the language there that would give us the flexibility to substitute those loan documents in place of the signed commitment letter. The documentation still has to be in a form and a format that is acceptable to the city, so that's not a provision that was given up as a result. In the second paragraph, the developer is simply warranting that with the developer financing and the incentive funding, that they have the funds necessary to build the project in its entirety. In section 3.03, A and B, the 2017 agreement included references to CID bonds. Again, those references were removed to reflect an anticipated single issue of TIF bonds only. Section 3.04 is probably really where the substance of the changes and the amendments to this agreement occur. Again, 3.04A, we're really cleaning up to address the single bond issue with TIF bonds. Section 3.04C in 2017, this outlined the conditions precedent to the city proceeding to issuance of the special obligation bonds. Again, remember that the timing and the phasing and substantial progress on other components of the project were controlled by that previous section with the development schedule and the phased project approach. When we're in a single construction phase, we need to look at what are the conditions, again, how do we protect the city's investment and ensure that we have substantial progress on the project. In the 2019 agreement, really the changes in the conditions precedent to bond issuance narrows the focus of how the bond proceeds can be spent, specifically related to work on the synergy component in the parking garage, and requires not only contracts but permits and notices to proceed. And again, we removed the references to construction of phase 2 or phase 3. So in 2017, in order to trigger a move to bond issuance, the developer was required to pour foundations and footings for the parking garage. And I think the thought behind that was if the parking structure is going, the commitment and the financing is in place for the larger project. And so now that so you're not going to build an 800 parking structure if you're not going to have the synergy and the hotel and all of those other uses that would drive that, because it's about a $16 million investment. Section 3.04E, B and C is a new section that was added to the 2019, or was recommended as an amendment in 2019 as the mechanism to control the distribution of the net bond proceeds. So we still have a set of conditions that are precedent to issuance of the bonds, but one of the things that has changed in where we stand today is where the developer is in their process of securing the private financing. The private lenders want us all to be standing shoulder to shoulder, right? So they want the city's bond proceeds. They want us to have been through that issuance process at the same time that their money goes into the deal along with the developer's equity. Again, this I think is the piece that has been missing in previous iterations of the development agreement that has really been central to the conversations that we've been having over the last several weeks. Again, though, we wanted to look at, it's one thing to issue the bonds, and a separate consideration to start releasing those bond proceeds. And we still wanted to tie the release of those net bond proceeds to substantial progress on the project. So you'll see in those conditions that there are a series of things that need to be met prior to the city issuing the first dollar going into that. And that includes 50% construction of the synergy component and 25% construction of the parking garage. In addition, 3.04ED is a new section requiring proof that approximately $63 million from the private lenders has been released and utilized in the project. Again, you know, we're going to stand equal together as we do this. 3.04EF, in the 2017 agreement, we anticipated executing a master funding agreement prior to issuance of the bonds. In 2019, we're recommending that we move that requirement for execution prior to distribution of any net bond proceeds. That gives us a little bit more time to negotiate. Now, knowing that there are multiple lenders in this, there are more people who are going to have an interest. And the master funding agreement is really critical because that is the document that binds the lender and the developer and the city together. The agreement, the development agreement, is that relationship between the city and the developer only. Section 3.04F adds a provision for an initial distribution of $7 million of net bond proceeds once all of these other conditions outlined in 3.04E have been satisfied. That was a conversation that was driven by the private lenders. Again, they're going to be at that point $63 million into the project, and so wanted the city to participate at that level, which we think, and Bruce will cover in another slide here shortly, kind of what that looks like in terms of our coming into the deal in terms of the total capital stack. Then in that section, it also specifies that the remaining net bond proceeds, which we're estimating to be about $34 million, or that's the target, would be dispersed pari passu with the loan portions of the developer financing. So 25% net bond proceeds to 75% developer financing. And then again, in section 3.04G, we just removed the references to the CID bonds. In section 310B, we had excluded certain costs as reimbursable without prior approval of the city. We've revised this, again, looking at creating more specificity regarding the use of net bond proceeds for those hard costs associated with the garage. So just narrowing that focus even further. In section 5.01, we established the requirements for payment of taxes, making payment an event, non-payment an event of default. Based on the recommendations of Bond Council in 2019, we've revised that to allow the city to withhold any pay-as-you-go reimbursements or net bond proceeds if the taxes were to be unpaid. So in effect, they don't, it stops our dollars from going into the deal. Section 10.13 just names a new attorney at Polsinelli. And those are really kind of the highlights of the changes. I'm happy to answer questions. Mr. Heaven, I'm sure, is happy to answer any questions. Or we can keep going and circle back with questions once we get all the way through, whatever your pleasure is.
Why the change in the CID bonds, or not issuing CID bonds?
The CID revenues are still pledged to the TIF bonds. It just simplifies it, having one issue. Don't need to have two issues.
Is there any change in the time length of the bond repayments or anything?
No, actually, with the CID bonds, they can go 22 years. The TIF can only go 20.
Right.
So it limits it to 20 years.
Did you have something?
The document that's in our packet, I think it seems like we're missing a page.
Yeah, I think I missed that too.
Because it doesn't have section 3.10, 3.10. It jumps, the alignment goes from again, what is the secret?
He means the actual document.
No, I mean the actual agreement.
I couldn't find section 2.04B2 either, which is called out, so it's in one other spot.
So I just,
Well, it's in the original.
So that's a reference back to the
Back
It's
to
original.
the original, that's the
Okay.
issue. It's not repeated in the amendment.
And I think on the amendment, the subsection B of section 310 is item number 11. So it's on the same page.
okay, I see
It's
that.
at the bottom. It's
Okay,
kind of
I see
indented
that.
a little bit, and I
Okay,
went looking for that as well.
all right. I thought.
Has the valuation of the land gone up since 2017? And if so, what percent has it gone up?
Actually, the assessed value of the property has decreased since, in part, we saw a decrease when the mall was originally demolished. And then subsequently, I think at least on two separate occasions, the developer has appealed the assessed valuation. So yes, and been successful in those appeals. But what that does is the base year, and I think if you looked at the chart on the separation of the TIF districts, so the base year valuation for the Gateway project area was about $2.5 million. The current assessed valuation is about $488,000, but the developer still has to get to the base. So they've got a greater distance to even get to the base before they start generating increment.
Or I had a question about 3.04E, little b and little c, which is the milestones related to completion of 50% of the construction of the synergy portion, or 50% cost and construction, and 25% of costs and completion of at least 25% of construction of the parking garage. I was wondering how we came up with those percentages as being adequate to the distribution trigger.
Well, I think that we just really recognize that those would be, I mean, if you are at that percentage of completion of a project, it's moving forward. I mean, I think we were just looking to pick something that, I don't know that there was any real magic to that number.
The 50% on synergy, we felt was a commitment that probably couldn't be reversed.
Okay.
And on the parking garage, the reason it's half of that is the city's bonds are going to be financing parking garage. So it was a little unfair to ask the developer to build 50% when in fact the city's paying most of those charges.
But there's no longer any max if the whole project is completed.
No, and there's no real way to apply that same
Yeah.
max. I mean, I think essentially, in order to pay off the special obligation bonds, the revenue from the entire project is going to be necessary to do that. So that becomes the incentive to get your bonds paid off, and then potentially reimbursed for with any tails.
Anything else?
Laura, the CID, is it starting still July 1st, 2020?
Correct.
Or- Okay, so
Yes.
nothing changes about
Nothing
that?
changes with that. Okay, Bruce, are you ready to walk through the finances of the deal?
I am, yeah.
Okay.
Everyone hear me?
I think they can, so you should have two handouts. So Bruce is going to kind of cover what is the city's position, again, relative to developer equity and private lenders as a proportion of the deal. Again, this is the first time that we've been able to factor those investments by the private lenders into the specific equation. So he'll cover that. There is a chart in the PowerPoint presentation which will demonstrate that. And then you also have, some of you may remember what we have affectionately referred to as the will sheet in honor of Councilmember Will Vandenberg. But it really takes a look at what are the other benefits that the city will receive. And I think one of the things that was absolutely critical, and I failed to touch on, was when we renegotiated the 2017 agreement, it was important for the city to be able to receive benefits from this project really from day one, and to not wait for tails. And so that sharing of the TIF general sales tax revenue and the transient guest tax helps us to accomplish that. So with that, Bruce, it's all yours.
Great, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Councilmember. So, Laura, during the conversation that we just had about dispersing bond proceeds, I think it probably makes sense just to go to the next slide in the PowerPoint, and then from there we can talk about the city benefit sheet. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Great. So looking at slide 15, this is a bar chart that I put together based on estimated funding contributions from developers, various sources, including the proposed special application law. And these are rounded numbers. Also, the timeline is a little bit condensed, as I'll describe in a moment. There might be some ongoing payments at the end of the period of the project, as there often are. But hopefully this gives a sense of how the different pieces of the capital stack, so to speak, are coming together. I think it's really significant that so far to date, the developer has invested upwards of $50 million into the project. There's been $38 million of developer equity, and then a little over $15 million or so of temporary loan financing from Metropolitan Commercial Bank. That's the orange part of the bar. You can see how that orange financing, that temporary financing, is then going to be taken out at the closing of the permanent financing, which is Carlisle, that's the gray bar, and Bank OZK, that's the first mortgage, which is the gold portion of the bar. Carlisle's money will go in first primarily, with the exception of about $13 million, maybe a little bit more even for Bank OZK right away on closing to help take out the temporary note or temporary loan. And then Carlisle will take over. You can see how that gray portion of the bar increases primarily over the next 5 to 6 to 7 months as that mezzanine loan financing comes into play, really financing almost all the costs over the winter and the spring until the conditions precedent for disbursement are met. And that's section 3.04E that Laura just described for you. So it's really, I think, significant to note that there will be at least a minimum of $63 million of other developer financing invested into this project between now and the city puts its money in. In actuality, based on the construction timelines and draw estimates that the developer has shared with us, it's likely that actually that will be closer to upwards of 70 or maybe even 75 million. So when you look at the bar that's titled June of 2020, when that first little part of blue comes in, that's the proposed $7 million initial investment of bond proceeds that would only, or definitely date specific, right? It's really contingent on those conditions precedent being met. But let's assume that does happen in June of 2020. Well, at that point, if you look at that entire bar, that's $7 million, but the rest of the bar is another $110 million that will be put into the project either in the past or even in that same month, based on the expected pace of development, in the summer of 2020. So as you look forward then from June of 2020 through October of 21, what we want to emphasize here is that this is where section 3.04F comes into play with that so-called pari passu or parity investment of bond proceeds with developer financing. And that's primarily the financing coming from the first mortgage on the property, which again is Bank OZK. That's the gold-colored part of the bar chart. And so for every $1 million of draw requests that are made each month, from that point forward, the idea is that $250,000 of that would come from the bond proceeds, and 750,000 of that would come from developer financing, again, primarily the first mortgage. So that's how things continue then through the remainder of the financing. Bank OZK will have upwards of $100 million, closer to $107 million in total. Carlyle, the mezzanine loan provider, will have somewhere between $55 and $60 million into the project, as well as some additional financing costs into the mix. Again, $38 million of equity, and the special obligation bonds target in total, that largest amount of blue on the final bar in October of 2021 is $34 million. So we feel like this is, as Pete mentioned, a fair way of putting the city's money in part because you are going to be financing a large chunk of that parking garage, but also protecting the city's interests, making sure that there's significant investments that have been made before you even invest a single dollar of those bond proceeds, and then making sure that the private lenders are putting in 3 times the amount of money for every dollar that you're putting in. And really, it's worth pointing out, I think, that that first mortgage lender at Bank OZK really truly has the most at stake in this project, other than the developer itself with its equity stake. And so, in some ways, we feel like we can piggyback on the due diligence and on the underwriting that Bank OZK is doing. Of course, we have our own rigorous analysis and all the work that has gone into the redevelopment agreement bears that out too. But we feel like going on a parity basis with Bank OZK really helps to protect the city's interests, because that private lender is going to want to make sure that everything is proceeding as it should, because they really ultimately have the most at stake from a financial perspective. Are there any questions about that bar chart or about the estimated disbursement of all of the different funds into the project?
I have a quick question. Bruce, it's Debbie. I have a quick question.
Hi, Debbie.
If a bank sells to another bank, do we have to go back and renegotiate or have any amendments or anything of that nature? Banks sell, frequently from one to another. So that would just be incorporated into the current agreement?
I'm going to let Pete actually answer that question.
He nodded.
I didn't want to steal your thunder, Bruce. No, they would just be a successor and automatically part of the development agreement.
And Debbie, the investors that will be buying the city's bonds, I do want to note also, because these are special obligation bonds, they're going to be sold in Gary and Kevin can go more about to talk more about this as well, but these bonds aren't going to be sold to the same investors that would be buying the city's general obligation bonds, that to be sold to everyone from a commercial bank to a mom and pop investor. These are going to be sophisticated, larger investors buying these special obligation bonds due to the more inherently risky nature of the felt it was important to stake a claim on some of the most valuable revenue streams, i.e. A portion of the general sales tax, the 1% general sales tax, and that it could be more generous, if you will, with some of the other tax streams, such as the property tip, because the city's share of that property tip is a relatively small percentage based on your relatively low bill rate to the city. So we've updated this chart based on the numbers that PGAD, which is the market research firm that's studying this project and providing TIF and CID estimates for this project, have provided. And so you can see, I'll just walk across the chart briefly. You can see that first column, estimated taxable sales, PGAD. They just released an updated edition of the report on the 7th. You can see how they're estimating taxable sales. This would be for all of the retail, all of the restaurant, entertainment, hotel, anything that's generating a taxable dollar of sales. This is their most recent projection of what those taxable sales will be over time. I also included a column after that in year-over-year growth. Of course, as the project is ramping up, you see some really big numbers, and then I think it's fair to say PJD is a pretty conservative number in terms of future growth after stabilization at just over 1%. And so, I think this is certainly an appropriately conservative revenue stream, but conservative nonetheless. So from those taxable sales, the next three columns are really different flavors of sales tax. The first one is your quarter-cent street sales tax that sunsets in 2022. And so, simply put, if you apply a quarter cent to the taxable sales that are estimated in the first major column, you get the numbers that you see start out quite low at 4,000 and ramp up to 100,000 and beyond. The shaded portion is just a reminder that, again, the city and its voters would need to re-up that street sales tax to, of course, receive those revenues in 23 and beyond. Similarly, with your park sales tax, that sunsets after 2023, that's 3/8%. A little bit more money per year, naturally, given that higher sales tax rate. But there also is a slightly darker shaded portion is a reminder that this would be contingent on the voters re-upping that park dedicated sales tax. Then finally, the third column with the blue header is the 0.45% of the city's general 1%. As Laura mentioned, the development agreement has 0.55% going to the TIF stream, so this is the non-TIF portion. And what I wanted to point out here is this is all pretty self-explanatory until you get down to 2039, and that goldenrod shaded cell indicates the first year in which you would receive the full 1% again. So given estimated sales in that year of just under $59 million, you can see it would be about $590,000 of 1% general sales tax, given that estimate. And then one more year in year 2040 to follow that. Similarly, with the non-TIF portion of the guest tax, which is a total of 9%, as you'll recall, the development deal receives 8% of that 9%, so the city would receive 1% of that. Your share is shown there through 2038, and then again, based on hotel-specific numbers, which aren't included as a breakout on this page. They're in a column just to the right of this page. You can see that once you start receiving the full 9%, you'd be receiving an estimated $940,000 and then $950,000 in 2040. Then finally, the base property taxes, as you know, with TIF, you do continue to receive the taxes that would be attributable from the city's mill rate based on that base value. As Laura and Brian have discussed, right now you are underneath the established base value for this project area. And so be some additional due value assessed next January of 2020. Then fiscal 21, we're estimating you would receive somewhere around $25,000 of base property taxes. And then finally, in 2023, once the value is well above that base value and it's actually generating tax increment, that's the point at which you would receive the full base taxes of roughly $45,000 per year. This also assumes that the city's mill rate stays the same at roughly 18 mils for the indefinite future. But then, again, if you go all the way down to the first year after the TIF term expires, you can see how your taxes based on that 18 mils would be roughly $542,000, and then go a little bit up with further value inflation. It's worth noting that TJB also uses a very conservative inflation factor as to the market value of the gateway going forward, and so to the extent that there's more inflation or more upfront valuation once the project is completed, that will certainly benefit the TIF initially, but then once that TIF expires in 2038, the numbers coming to the city could be significantly higher than the $540,000 that we've shown here. Then finally, stormwater. Let me actually just take a break there for a second, because if I can just draw your attention to the chart below, what we've tried to do is show the city base taxes in green, the city share of sales taxes, which would be both your special rates and your percentage of the general rate in blue, and then your portion of the guest tax in orange. And that's really noticeable, right, where you go from getting 1% to the full 9% in those last 2 years that are shown here. But then I also wanted to include, because it has been included in previous versions of the will sheet, for stormwater assessment and utility fees. The assessments are given as part of a previous deal. It's really not impacted by this amendment. And as you know, it's roughly $600,000 per year. That goes through 2034. So that's still about $9.6 million. And your stormwater utility fees, assuming you keep your current rate structure roughly the same and the number of units doesn't change significantly, it should be about $78,000 per year. So not a huge amount, but still significant, especially when you look at it in aggregate. Before I finish up with the information on the far right part of the page, are there any questions about any of the specific columns or the assumptions?
I have one. The stormwater assessment utility fees happen no matter what, right?
Correct.
Correct.
Okay. So the $11.2 million that makes up happens no matter what, in theory. Should we be a little careful about counting that as, part of the benefits of all this? Since those are things, at least with the assessment, those are things that had to happen in order for this project to even be possible. I don't know.
Well, we wouldn't be getting it if it wasn't.
We wouldn't have probably put $12 million into the property if this wasn't happening either, though. So we wouldn't be worried about getting paid back for the money that we had to invest up front. So it's not like it's money that we're making, it's money that we're getting back for what we've already invested. Not saying we should have done it, but let's be cognizant of that when we look at some of these numbers. Also, I think, it's almost $6 million of that benefit is made up by taxes, which may not be extended in a couple of years, so we should think about that a little bit too. You add all that together, and you're talking 17+ million of that 28 benefit that you may or may not consider as much of a benefit. I don't know. Just want to make sure we're thinking about some of that.
That's definitely a fair point, and why we wanted to make sure we highlighted that and noted that it wasn't given. At the same time, I would note again that everyone's crystal ball on this is imperfect, and I would reiterate the in terms of taxable sales as well as property values. I think it's worth noting that I don't feel like this is a rose-colored look at the city's future revenues. So even if you were to, hedge on the possibility that those special sales taxes might not be renewed or might be renewed at a different level, I think there's also a possibility that some of the other revenue sources that would be ongoing could be higher than what is shown here.
Maybe, I'm sorry, quick
But
question.
finally, I've taken a lot of time, and I know you have other
Hang on, Bruce.
cover as well.
Bruce, I think we have a couple more questions for you before you're off the hook.
Sure.
Along those same lines, and maybe this is more of a long-term planning question, but have we looked at any of our anticipated expenses that will complement these revenue streams for Gateway in the next 20 years? So things that we're anticipating that we'll have to spend that would ultimately come out of this 28.
I mean, I think we've started that conversation. I think we've been talking for a couple of years about particularly what public safety resources might be required to support this project. As we evaluated some of that in relationship to the 2020 budget, I know that the police department was collecting information on calls generated by synergy complexes in other communities and comparing that to our current call loads, and felt like that incrementally over time, as we got a better understanding of what those were, certainly we would be in a position to evaluate those, but kind of an ongoing assessment of what that need might be.
I also had one question kind of related to the points that Nick made. Would it be fair to say that the structure of this deal, if we're thinking about future deals potentially, gives us an incentive for our tax code to be heavily special sales tax based as opposed to, say, raising our mill levy in terms of what we get back?
Yeah, I would say you do have an incentive to do that, yes. I think you'll want to keep a balanced approach, as you have in the past, but there's certainly, if this project does materialize as we're all hoping and thinking it will at this point, certainly this will be a significant driver of taxable sales in the community, and I think, you'll just want to have a robust discussion about the pros and cons of this revenue stream or source as opposed to others, and how does this also impact other businesses such as along Johnson Drive. And I know that you'll figure out a just and equitable approach, but certainly with these kind of numbers and possibly higher numbers, if this helps to generate spin-off development, you do certainly have, I think, an interest in continuing to have a certain amount of your city budget come from special sales taxes.
Thank you. I think Ken has one more question.
One more.
Sorry, Bruce, you can't see us, but we have more questions. Ken?
Yeah.
Overall, in these projects, when you think about the previous mall and its lifespan was limited, and then it was demolished. 20 years is typically a lifespan, isn't it, of something like this in terms of development? How long beyond 20 years is it going to likely continue to exist?
Well, I would say,
Be a genie if you could do that.
well, I would say that the mall was brick and mortar retail, which is declining. Everything we're building here, if you try to think about it, it's a place to live, it's a place to stay, entertainment, eating, those kind of things. So I think the things that we're building are better situated to survive longer term than wood, because I know some people have asked, why aren't we building a Kohl's or brick and mortar retail, I think is going to change. Amazon is changing that model and it's doing it successfully. So I think we are actually, in this project, I think better off.
Yeah, some more diverse than just having a mall or big stores there.
Anything else for Bruce?
Thanks, Bruce.
Hang on, he has one more.
Oh, Bruce has one more.
Just two more quick comments. One is that this doesn't include a whole handful of revenue sources that we decided as a group not to highlight here, such as development-related revenues that you'll actually collect during the planning and construction of all these different components. Also, I know the city has a business licensing fee structure that we aren't estimating the revenues from all the different types of business licenses that is in play here. And then also there is that somewhat obscure city portion of the county sales tax, and we don't count that into the tax as well. So we wanted to really focus on the ones that were of, I guess, the most ongoing importance and that really were as transparent as possible. And so wanted to just note that that was not part of this.
You also have franchise fees
And
too.
franchise fees.
Funny enough, when I was looking at the market feasibility study, alcohol tax, it's gonna be a lot of alcohol sales generated. Although we only get a third of that to our general fund, it'll be a little boost.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you.
Okay, so what next? Kind of walk through the proposed amendment to the third amended and restated redevelopment agreement. And so really, we're looking at the goal of trying to align timing for all of the funding sources to allow this project to move forward in accordance with the revised development schedule. We've talked a little bit about the fact that we now have the private lenders involved in that conversation, and some of their requirements in part are contributing to the need to separate conditions for bond issuance from this distribution of net bond proceeds. I will tell you that we have taken some preliminary steps that move the city and the developer closer to a bond issuance without requiring the city to take on any risk in that process. We've gone through the process of selecting a bond underwriter. The bond underwriter is in place, and the folks from Gilmore and Bell can elaborate kind of more on their role, but they do not get paid, they're not compensated unless the bond issue moves forward. So there's no risk to the city. In addition, we reviewed their contract, and that contract could be terminated at any time. The second piece, which you've heard a couple of references to this evening, is a market feasibility study completed in process by PGAV. This feasibility study really goes out and helps test the waters, if you will, to test the market, to establish the feasibility of selling the bonds in the market. That market feasibility study, we looked at qualifications of a couple of firms, selected PGAV, and then the developer has escrowed the cost, the funds to pay for that market feasibility study. So again, allowing the conversation to move forward without creating any risk for the city at this point. I think at this point, I'd like to turn it over to either Gary Anderson or Kevin Wemby with Gilmore and Bell to talk a little bit about what the next steps could be if we were to move to bond issuance.
Thank you, Laura. So we have a very colorful and lengthy calendar of events, which is very standard in issuance of these types of bonds. And we're at the second step on this calendar, which is the meeting tonight. As Laura said, underwriter D.A. Davidson has been selected, who will market the bonds. The key thing that was mentioned earlier, I think by Bruce, is that the bonds will only be sold and resold to what are called qualified institutional investors. I want to impress your friends at your next cocktail party, where they're generally called quibs in the industry. So the quibs will only sell to other quibs, and that's sort of a self-enforcing process, but the documents will say over the top of them, they can only be sold to quibs and resold to quibs. And quibs are institutions that manage more than $100 million, or broker-dealers who have capital of more than $10 million. So these are the sophisticated investors, and that goes to kind of the nature of the risk of these types of investments, because unlike a geo bond, there are a whole bunch of things that can impact the revenue stream. A lot of times they're sort of outside the control of any of the parties. For example, the state may change the rules on property tax, or they may exempt, food and beverage from sales tax, or they may do something that might impact the revenue stream. So, unlike a general obligation bond, the only source of repayment is this pledged revenue stream. So if something goes wrong during that period, 20-year period, and there's not enough revenues, bondholders, take a loss at the end of the day. So it's one of the best protections from the city standpoint, is that it'll only be QIBs that'll be investors in these. So, assuming you move forward on the resolution to separate the project areas into 5 redevelopment districts, and you move forward on the DA amendment, which is anticipated to be October the 16th, we are working with the Underwriters Council, and PGAV and Pete and city staff on the bond documents. Those are circulating now. We actually had a call with the underwriter and their counsel this morning, talking about some of the particular provisions. As was alluded to earlier, assuming you adopt the resolution to separate the redevelopment areas into 5 districts, this big certified mail will go out to all of the owners and occupants of property within those 5 redevelopment areas, which hopefully will become districts. As Laura mentioned, one of the things that you can do as part of this process is, if you decide you don't want some of those other redevelopment areas to become redevelopment districts, you can decide, hey, we don't want to do those anymore, we want to reevaluate those at some later date. So this process gives you the option to do what you want to do. Now, I think you're locked in on redevelopment District 1 and 2A, which is cap-fed, but the other 3 you're sort of free to do as you desire, because there's no approved plans with respect to those other 3 areas. Then we would anticipate coming back on the 6th of November for a resolution to release the offering document and to give the mayor authority to sign the bond purchase agreement with certain parameters. And the parameters would be, maximum principal amount, certain interest rate parameters, etc. Because one of the things that's happening is we are moving into the end of the year in the municipal bond world. So basically, especially the QIBs will have all of their capital deployed, so you sort of have to get into the market no later than late November, early December. Right now the calendar anticipates that on November the 18th we would come back with the bond ordinance. Assuming you approve that resolution on November the 6th, the underwriter would have started marketing during that 2-week period with the QIBs. Assuming you adopt the ordinance on the 18th, the bond pricing would occur the next day, and then the mayor would have the authority to execute the bond purchase agreement. And the current timing is the closing of the bonds, which is the funding, would occur on December 12th. There's about 2.5 week period there. 1, because of Thanksgiving, and 2, the bond transcript has to go to the Kansas Attorney General for approval, and the bonds go to the state treasurer for registration. That's a lot of dates, a lot of info. Happy to answer any question about sort of where we are on the bond process, or any questions related thereto.
Any questions on bonds?
Based on our kind of uncertainty where the bowling alley is, I think that's District 3. There's no concern on your part about establishing that as a district with the unknown of where we are on the bowling alley.
Well, that's probably a good example of how you want to evaluate that particular one. As Laura said earlier, even though we, potentially we may carve this into 5 redevelopment district, the base values from the original district stay in place. So on Gateway, we have a negative value. That is not true on Mission Bowl, because it was valued as, before it had its problems. So that's one of the things we have had some discussion with Laura about. Now, there's a timing issue related to, it being a dangerous building and when it might be torn down and whether it would still meet the conditions of a TIF. So, you may want to think about how you want to deal with that particular one more from a longer-term redevelopment of that particular area. Thank you.
So we've thrown a tremendous amount of information, so I'm going to back up just a little bit, because a lot of information and a lot of moving parts and pieces as they relate to consideration of it into a bond issuance. But I think the first question we have to back up and ask is, our first goal and what we're really considering this evening is that amendment to the redevelopment agreement. So the question to be answered is, have we successfully transferred those protections and provisions from the 2017 agreement into the new deal in 2019? And if so, then it would be appropriate for the council to consider moving forward with that amendment. That then sets the framework for us to continue a conversation about moving to bond issuance. It's not automatic. Remember, there are still a number of conditions that the developer is required to meet before we move to that. So in order to meet the time frame, I think that the time frame that Gary just ran through is very aggressive, and that assumes that we hit everything right along the way. And again, trying to get all of those funds, private lender, bond proceeds, and developer equity all aligned in the project to allow us to proceed on the construction schedules as anticipated. So I think that the fundamental question is, do we feel comfortable in making that transition from the 2017 agreement to the 2019 agreement?
Sounds like you guys have done your due diligence, and the protection for the city is built into it, and I feel comfortable with moving forward.
I think it is nice that the overall project should get done on a quicker timeline.
Yeah.
We move in this direction. It's beneficial for everybody involved.
Absolutely.
So what happens if the development stipulations aren't met regarding the 25 and the 50% on the synergy? What happens with all that bond money at that point? Is it?
Yeah. That was a nice segue into our last slide, which is kind of the risk analysis.
Oh,
So I think
okay,
there's a variety of questions, no, so it's perfect. So I think we have to ask ourselves some questions. What is the risk of doing nothing now? I think we're past that. I think we all understand that if we don't do anything, you don't have a mechanism in a development agreement that allows the project to proceed on its current course. So if we can't get the funding aligned, then the chances of this project getting completed are significantly diminished. What happens if the city issues the bonds and the project doesn't move forward, right? So you've got the bond proceeds held in escrow, and they would be returned, or they'd be used to pay off the bonds at that point. What happens if the city issues the bonds, starts distribution, and the project stalls? Again, as Gary mentioned, it's the revenues, the repayment of those bonds is dependent on the revenues that are being thrown off of this project in terms of sales tax and property TIF and transient guest tax. So if the project doesn't move forward, the bondholders are not repaid. There's no financial risk to the city in any of these scenarios with the special obligation bond. And that was absolutely a key component of the 2017 deal, was moving to a special obligation bond issuance only. Does that mean there's not reputational risk if the project were not to move forward? Absolutely not. But again, it's trying to find that balance of how do we all work together to accomplish the goal that we've set out to do for both of our mutual benefits. Did that answer your question, Kristen?
Absolutely, thank you.
Ben?
Can we hear a little bit from the developer in terms of what your sense of where things are?
Yeah.
Okay.
For those of you that I didn't get to say hello to, I'm Matt Valenti. Nikki came in afterwards, and Hillary, you came in the middle, and RC, I didn't get to see you, and Kristen, sorry.
It's nice to see you again, Matt.
Sorry my dad couldn't be here. My mom had surgery today, but she's fine. So Brian gave a pretty good update. Some of the things that might be a little bit different or further along than even your update, we did complete the JCW abandonment. If you happen to go by the site in the last few days, you've noticed there's a new retaining wall on the southeast corner of Synergy along Row. So we've actually finished the Synergy pad in that corner. Olson recertified the pad on Monday, and we're turned over completely to them as far as the pad goes. We have the JCW commercial connection permit. So they've started their underground plumbing with their grease work and their sanitary. And you should see them going vertical by the middle of December. We have a weekly call with their contractor, VCC. VCC's done over 50 theaters across the country, AMC, Cinemark. They're a national contractor. So they're on top of it. We did have a little bit of delay in getting the JCW permits, but I think that we're past all that, and we're moving along well now. Emory Sap is actually going to start doing the grading on the parking garage because that's part of our overall earthwork permit. And as Brian mentioned, we'd like to get started on the foundations for that before the end of the month if we can, so we can keep the schedule for the Synergy. As far as the whole project goes, it's a big difference from where we were in 2017, even in the summer of 2018. Now that we have Synergy and this agreement with Colicchio, being able to move forward with the entire project, it's going to be better for us. It's better for you all. It's the lenders are on board now, so we're in a great position to get the whole thing done. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any questions.
Yep.
Could you just speak, it makes sense to me why the project budget would change, because the scope of what you're doing has changed, but could you just speak a little bit about the major changes in your project budget?
Sure.
Being so different from the original agreement?
We added another level of parking to the parking deck, another floor plate to the office. Also, the 2017 budget was really just, it had placeholders for junior anchor retail entertainment. So we didn't have a Synergy deal, we didn't have a food hall deal. The Synergy deal, it's almost an $18 million building with an additional $9 million in FF&E that goes in there. And the food hall is, it's really going to be about over $300 a square foot when all is said and done, between construction costs and FF&E, probably be close to $400 a square foot. So those are the major components that changed. The residential is pretty similar to where we were before, and the hotel costs are probably pretty similar to where we were. They came up a little bit, I think. We added a pool over to the residential area as well. We felt like coming across from the Johnson Drive apartments all the way over to where the hotel was kind of a long walk for people that wanted to get to the pool. So we've kind of created a small area and dropped that pool in for the residents. It'll be closer proximity to them. So a lot of different pieces that increase costs.
I know that you've got your contingency fees in here, but do you anticipate that inflating anymore, or is this final?
I would like to think it's final.
Anything else?
Do you have anything, Matt, currently in the purview of your development company that is close to this, the venue with the entertainment? Do you have anything like that you've done?
So it's interesting. Synergy, while this is the 5th or 6th Synergy, the owner, Jeff Benson, created Movie Tavern. And he sold that to Southern Cinemas, I think they're out of New Orleans, back in the early 2000s, I think, maybe mid-2000s. And it's since been purchased again by Marcus up out of Minneapolis. So that was a very successful concept that he created. We actually have a movie tavern in one of our projects in Syracuse. It's anchored, it's kind of a quasi mixed use. It's spread over 40 acres, so it's not as dense and vertical as this, but it's got a Costco, a bunch of restaurants, like freestanding restaurants, some strip restaurants, with a movie tavern, some medical office, apartments behind it, a True Hotel, which is a Hilton product, attached to it. And then we just opened a 30,000 square foot office for the hospital actually there, which is it's got like a surgery center and urgent care and stuff like that for the hospital. Actually, it's the State University of New York Hospital.
RBC, what's your question?
Yeah, first off, I'm really excited to hear that before the end of the month, we anticipate starting on the foundation of the parking garage. Would be...
Assuming we get the permit.
Jump ahead.
Brian doesn't want me doing it without the permit.
Absolutely not. So can you remind me how we're going to separate, how you guys plan on separating the residential parking from the public?
So the residential comes in, the connections to the parking garage are at level 3 now, since there's 4. So you'll actually go up to level 3, park, and then walk across right into your apartment buildings.
So is there anything stopping the public or anybody from, I mean, I know that I've seen other parking garages where they have like key cards and a door opens, or they have a gated arm. Is there anything that?
We're putting conduits in case we want to do that.
Okay, that's.
But I think we're trying to stay away from that for right now. It's all public, but if you're a shopper or going to the hotel or going to the food hall, you're not going to want to park up there.
Right.
I mean, it's going to be it's going to be pretty far for you to travel back down.
So, and then in our previous, I know that we had discussions about security in our previous plans. We had talked about security cameras or?
Yeah, we've got cameras and we've got the pole, like the panic. Yeah.
That's just a lot of space and area that is just.
The good thing is it's so the old plan was a little bit more spread out, and even because we went up a floor, we were actually able to, the overall footprint's condensed a little bit, so it's not quite as expansive. And one whole side facing Synergy, all daylights. And then the screen that's on it, it's perforated, so it'll allow quite a bit of light in. You're never going to be feeling like you're fully enclosed.
I just feel like the more we invest in the safety of that area, then the less we have to spend on it.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Anyone else? Yep. Others?
Yeah. Do you have any anticipated art that will be featured as part of the design?
I don't personally, but Josh Shelton, who's one of the partners at El Dorado, is very into art, and he has some very big ideas on what we should incorporate into kind of that public green space. So we're talking about that actually.
I know, I'd like to see that. I'm sure that would be one conversation.
Yeah, I think that space lends itself pretty well to what Josh is on a couple of boards here, even though we moved to Portland, and he was talking about the fact that you could actually have some exhibits going in and out of there. So yeah, we've talked about that.
Yeah, just to be brief, you don't need to go into detail, but because Element does go into some sustainability practices, can you give me some examples of sustainable features of the
Oh, the Element, no plastic straws. I think a lot of the, they try and do a lot of the recyclable cups and things like that, as opposed to having to wash everything. They're trying to, all their lighting is LED, so that they're doing all those things are kind of, they're not necessarily up to what's the standard. They're not LEED like platinum or anything like that, but they are trying to follow a lot of those.
no solar panels on the top?
No, but they are trying to follow those LEED pieces, yeah.
Thanks.
a resolution that would move forward to next week's city council meeting that would consider approving the amendment to the redevelopment.
I move that we take that to city council next term and non-consent.
All right, thank you. Our last item on tonight's agenda is an ordinance excluding certain portions of land from the city of Mission's corporate limits, otherwise known as the Roland Park de-annexation. Laura?
Yes, thank you. This is really just the ordinance that would accomplish that de-annexation. You will recall that you adopted Resolution 1034 last month, which called the public hearing for 7 p.m. next Wednesday. Required notices have been sent and published in the legal record. And then this is the ordinance that would appear on your agenda next week if you wanted to move forward with the de-annexation process.
Where are we in negotiations?
So Councilmember Flora and Councilmember Inman are working with two designated representatives, council members from Roland Park, to see if we can sit down and get all of the deal points hammered out before we get to next week. We're going to try our best to see if we can get there and just wrap this up and be done with it.
So how you gonna get that info to me? After they get this all hammered out, when am I gonna hear about it?
Well, it depends on when they get their meeting set. So yes, we'll either get it to you in advance of the meeting or we'll present that at the meeting and give you that option before you take action on this ordinance.
All right.
Okay?
Just to verify, so that stoplight there as is right now, we own 3 of the 4 poles. It would end up being 2 of them in Roland Park, right?
We lease, yes, we
Lease.
lease 3 of the 4 poles. And they have agreed, the letters have gone to KCP&L, and so they're paying now 25% of that cost, and we're paying
So
75%.
the issue is only the retrospective cost of that.
It's wrapping up the 50% commitment going forward for the signals, and then the cost of that transfer of land.
And then if we see any drastic traffic patterns that change 5 years from now or whatever, is there any benefit at all for not having 2 of the poles in Roland Park and 2 in Mission? Or does that make any difference?
It doesn't, the
Does it-
location of the poles doesn't really control how the traffic signals manage the flow of
I
traffic.
was reading back through some previous stuff and that seemed to be a big sticking point for some reason. I didn't.
I mean, I think if you look
I
at
don't know,
it,
Betty, if you remember any of that
you know,
conversation.
I do.
Realistically-
Based on what you're talking about, but
I think if you look realistically at the fact that essentially all of the corners would be developed, we've gone through, there's, you know, the micro hospital and the Commerce Bank that went in, the medical office building that's proposed on that land now has had a traffic study associated with it. The Gateway project has had traffic studies associated with it. So those considerations have been given and would continue if there was a major change in any of the development on any of those corners.
Laura, I know we had the response from Roland Park previously, agreeing in principle to all the deal terms except for the dollar figure.
Yes.
Would there be a way to go ahead and get that 50% letter locked up, separate from Kristen and I's negotiations? Just, they could send a letter to KCP&L that would say, upon publication of the de-annexation ordinance on or about, I forget whatever date it is, we will assume 50%, because then we just have fewer things to cover.
Right, I mean, I think absolutely, it's just the method and how we get them to do that, so.
Okay.
Could be a great thing to take to negotiations.
Well, I was just thinking, since we already had an agreement on that piece, if we could just, draft a proposed letter for them to send or whatever that would follow their 25% letter and just get that out of the way, so we don't have to also address, we can just focus on the financial piece at our negotiations.
We can give you a 50% letter to take with you, sir.
Oh, to take with us, all right.
when is your meeting, do you know?
We are for sure meeting next Wednesday, so the same day. That was when we could get in person to work, but I think we're still, Chris and I were going to discuss if an earlier call or email exchange would make sense as well. Anything else?
Okay. I'll go ahead and propose to move forward on the
So this would appear, the public hearing is at the top of the agenda next week, and then, typically you'll have a public hearing and then your action on whatever is occurring in that public hearing or being discussed in that public hearing occurs later in the meeting. In this instance, you would have consideration of this ordinance immediately following that, because you may recall that Roland Park has had to call a special meeting in order to take action on their portion, so that we can align those on the same day. So the format-wise, it will look a little bit different than what we typically do with a public hearing and action.
Anything else? All right, we don't have any discussion items tonight, or do we have any department updates?
Nope, I don't have a voice left.
All right, that concludes our finance and
Two
administration.
quick things.
Oh, yep.
One, please eat this candy, because I'm not going to. And two, is that my water bottle? Because that looks like my water bottle.
It's got my name on it.
All right, that concludes our finance and administration committee meeting.
And we have a retreat set, right? That's all.
Yes, we have our retreat set for Saturday, October 26th at 8:30 at the community center. I will send you the, we'll get some information out, probably first of next week. Are you gone?
But I'll get the back.
Is everyone in the parade? Yes, you do have.